Okay, fellow members of the Corporate Power Task Force. Okay, this is the presentation I gave at the UU Metro conference a year or so ago in the spring with Carol Allen. And I just want to go over it. It's a good starting point, I think, perhaps, for our task force. I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but we'll follow this up with a Zoom conference call. And if you've got any questions on it, or want to expand on it, or take different parts of it, however it works, but I still think it's a decent introduction to the way I look at corporate power, which is, here's us regular folk down here, and of course this is the corporate persons that we have trundling around the landscape. And of course, it's not a person. The people are inside there. That's an illusion. Okay, so let's start with making a distinction between the Constitution and corporate law. Now, the Constitution was set up to provide the framework for the existence and exercise of power in our republic. And it identified three sources of power. The people, not the states, the people, and the people are the ones who ratified the convention, not the states. There were conventions in each state, specially elected by every town and district and county in the land, and they met exclusively for this purpose and involved one of the most democratic efforts ever in the world. There's a great book out on this called Ratification by Pauline Maya, The People Debate the Constitution. So any references I make to ratification are in large part from that book. So it is the people, primary, in the preamble. And of course, the first articles lay out the separation of powers within the federal government, Congress, President, Supreme Court. Article 4 refers to the states and does indeed guarantee that each state shall have a republic as a form of government. And of course, during the ratification, the people demanded a Bill of Rights to assure their protection from whatever new government was set up. They just got rid of a government that they thought oppressed their rights. They wanted to have that in the Constitution, in black and white. Okay, so we have people, federal government, states. That's all the Constitution talks about. It's all the Constitution recognizes. However, over pretty much the life of the Republic, things were changed. Things changed. In 1939 or so, Felix Frankfurter was appointed to the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt, and he made this observation that the word corporation appears not once, i.e. exactly 0 times in the Constitution. And yet, as he says, the history of constitutional law is largely the result of modern corporations having impact upon the American scene, politics, culture, the economy, for sure. All right, but very early in the Republic, there were corporations, but they were strictly formed by the states. It's not something that was specifically allocated to the federal government, so it fell to the states. And each corporation was formed by an act of the state legislature. Could initiate with the state legislature or a group of shareholders that was trying to accomplish something that individual investors couldn't afford on their own. Or the state could require something, i.e. like the Erie Canal. In any case, a charter was was drafted and agreed upon, and every charter included a term of the charter, a term for the existence of this amalgamation of investment and shareholders and managers that we call the corporation, and it had a clear purpose, and it had the only reason they would form a corporation if it accomplished a public good. A public good. That was not the motivation, that the shareholders make money. No. Nobody said they couldn't make a profit or make it worth their while, but the idea was to provide a public good. That was the be-all and end-all. It had a clear purpose, a clear limit in terms of years, and the books were open. There's no question about that. They were an arm of the state. The state could run it just like an agency. They could show up, they could stay there, they could look at those books day by day if they wanted to. And that went on for 20, 30 years early in the Republic. And then a variety of things started to happen. Now, just to go back for a minute, at one point during the ratification, Jefferson, who I believe was in Paris at the time, wrote a letter to Madison. They were in close correspondence during the whole period. And he suggested, after reviewing the Constitution, that there be a no monopolies amendment. And it didn't make the final cut. I think it got, the list I saw, it got down to the last 12, but then did not make it. Okay, but still, states had a clear idea that they formed special corporations to achieve specific purposes. Now, then a case came up to the Supreme Court, Dartmouth versus Woodward, and Dartmouth College was chartered by the king before the Revolution. And then after the Revolution, some people in the state, or maybe even some of the students, questioned how Dartmouth was going about their business. They were set up as an entity, a separate entity that had their, they didn't have a limit to their lifespan of their charter. It was a charter from before the Revolution. And the Constitution does talk about not impinging on contracts that were already in place before the Constitution. Nonetheless, the state brought suit against Dartmouth. I probably myself would have found in favor of Dartmouth. It seemed a little arbitrary what the state was trying to do at the time, and they didn't formulate that charter. But that got widely interpreted, or some might say misinterpreted. They took it to the extent that charters were no longer something granted by the state, at the will of the state, by a vote of the state. It became a contract between the state and the shareholders. So it took the state right down to the level of the shareholders. Now they're at equal terms once this supposed contract is signed. But then, because of that, many states wrote stuff into their state law saying what had to be in a charter, and every charter included the things that I talked about before, specifically limited life, a specific purpose, and a public good. Now, that situation existed until the Civil War. And in the Civil War, or coming up to the Civil War, of course, railroads got very large. They got large, they operated across many states. They weren't so big before the Civil War, but certainly afterwards. They all made great profits during the Civil War. But the first concern after the Civil War was knitting back the Republic, and the 14th Amendment in particular took the Bill of Rights and said, well, this applies to all citizens of every state. The Constitution is indeed the supreme law of the land, and it applies, including the Bill of Rights, to every citizen, every person in the Union, in any state of the Union. And also, it said people were to receive equal protection before the law and be availed of due process. Now, of course, this was meant to protect newly freed slaves. However, in the first 30, 40 years of the Fourth Amendment, the number of cases that involved actually freed slaves was minuscule. The railroads, however, because they had grown to be bigger, so to speak, than states, played states against each other with this equal protection phrasing, and also dabbled in this concept of persons. And they banged away at this enough so that by 1886, in the famous case of Santa Clara versus South Pacific, the Supreme Court acknowledged that corporations were indeed persons in light of the 14th Amendment. It wasn't even actually a decision. It was just in the summary of the case, or the head notes, but it's been accepted as the law of the land. Around the same time, railroads getting so big were beginning to bump into each other and compete for the same markets and this and that. And since each railroad requires immense investment, you know, it's not like you close a store and maybe move to the next town. You know, you've laid track and this and that. It's a big investment. Competition is ruinous, as I believe Vanderbilt said. And they actually initiated the move to develop the first federal agency, you know, as we know them today, a federal agency to oversee a portion of activity in the Republic not specifically discussed in the Constitution. And I have a book on that I have actually two books. I can't quite lay my hand on the other one. Railroads and Regulations, 1877 to 1916, Gabriel Colco. And the upshot of it was that the railroad giants finally decided it doesn't really matter too much what the act says and how it sets up the regulation, which essentially they wanted to be a cartel to set prices, to set fares that other people couldn't undercut them, small competitors. And one of the heads of one of the railroads said, don't worry about the details. We'll get our guys on the commission. The first agency, the revolving door concept, came right along with it. Now I'm skipping from 1880 to almost 100 years later. And there was, of course, the New Deal and legislation back and forth fighting that. But the one I wanted to go to next was Buckley v. Valero, which is the first time the court, in its ultimate wisdom, decided that money is equivalent to speech and allowed protection under the First Amendment. And of course that was exacerbated manyfold by Citizens United versus FEC. And now unlimited corporate money can be spent on politics. Okay, so this all contributed to a vast change in the way charters now look compared to the way they used to look. Now, this is a summary. Part of it is from the list, the left side of the list having to deal with then, before the 1850s or so. This book is by Tom Hartman, Unequal Protection, The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights. So most of what I write in the left side is from that book. The other side is basically from my reading of actual New York State corporate law, black and white law. It's on the books. And again, as I mentioned before, then they had specific purpose, specified duration. There's no concept of personhood. Nowadays, anybody can file for a corporation. It's just a procedure. You submit, you pay your fee, you're a corporation. You follow up with some reporting requirements, you're a corporation. And you have perpetual life. But there's nothing that says you can't voluntarily dissolve your corporation anytime you want, like you hear of periodically when a corporation's pension obligations are too much for them. And the wording is actually in there, at least in New York State law. They can participate as natural persons. This corporation can participate as a natural person in any kind of proceeding, legislative, judicial, administrative. They're treated as persons. Okay, that makes some sense. But of course, it got tied in with them now being, oh, if they're persons, they have rights. Now, they had very much less rights back in the 1850s. The charter could be revocable by the state pretty much at will. If they didn't fulfill the charter, if the corporation exceeded the charter, or if it misbehaved. Didn't have to provide a heck of a lot in terms of due process. It's almost like the state grants you a driver's license. They can take that driver's license or revoke it for a number of reasons. I guess they have to be documented, but there's not like a big proceeding involved. And the same thing used to be the case with corporations. They kept them on a tight leash. Nowadays, revocation is not even mentioned. It doesn't talk about fulfilling the charter or exceeding the charter. The charter is something you write when you submit your application to be a corporation, and it's pretty much a rubber stamp. And as a matter of fact, you can revise the charter and resubmit. And yeah. And now other specifics that are vastly different. And you can imagine the consequences. You don't have to imagine them. That's what exists today. Directors had, in the beginning, directors had to be one of the stockholders or some of the stockholders. That's not mentioned now. Headquarters could be only where the business was located. Now they can have businesses anywhere, inside or out of the U.S., and certain specific things were prohibited. Owning stock in other corporations with corporate money. Can't just buy another corporation to get bigger. No. You can only use corporate money for the specific purpose at hand. Couldn't do real estate. No political contributions. That was obvious to them. And no charitable contributions, because that could be easily manipulated into a favor for a senator or whatever. You contribute to his favorite fund or some project, a library in his district. No charitable contributions. No libraries, no schools, no church, no nothing. And all records, as I mentioned before, were open to the state at any time. Now, none of that matters. Corporations buy other corporations all the time, and antitrust law has been moribund for the last 30 years. They can own property anywhere. Political contributions are not even mentioned. The records, they were trying to play catch up with things like Sarbanes-Oxley. making it's a little more rigorous and supposedly accountable. It's not like you can show up at any time and just look at their records. So now this is what the corporation looks like compared to, if you recall, the otherwise much more simple structure in the earlier slide. And what hopefully is the most prominent feature of this is this circle surrounding the corporation. That circle separates us, citizens, shareholders, customers, employees, people lower down in the hierarchy of the corporation, suppliers. It separates everybody from people within the circle, within the club. Corporate law, of course, says this is to be treated as a single person. Forget whoever's inside there. They don't exist. It can go on forever. And they must maximize profits. That's in the law. That's their purpose. Forget about public good. They must maximize profits. Ostensibly, they tell us for shareholder benefits, for the shareholders' benefit, but shareholders outside the circle, okay, that's one thing, but that's not what's driving this. People inside the circle now are the biggest shareholders. So that directly benefits the people inside the circle. They're granted free speech. This is granted free speech, but people inside the circle are deciding, oh, I could spend $10 million on my favorite candidate. So we're giving power to a corporation, so to speak, a corporate person. We're giving power to people already well protected. Equal protect. Yeah, these people in the circle, that whole circle and anybody in it, is supposed to be treated equally before the law as you and me. And not only that, not only is that circle there, if you notice, indicated, there's gatekeepers just inside the wall. There's lawyers, if anybody tries to actually penetrate what they call the corporate veil. There's lobbyists to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't even happen. There's PR to convince everybody else out here, citizens, shareholders, everybody, that this is hunky-dory, this is great, wealth will trickle down, the free market rules, and all of this stuff. Indemnity, specifically protecting them from individual culpability. They have rights to privacy. You can't just show up and do an OSHA inspection. No, you need a warrant, you need notice, you need to set a time. They have the same rights of privacy, and probably more than you and I do, because they have gatekeepers besides. All right, so this is the picture I have in my mind, just like that big guy in armor in the first slide. Yeah, it looks like a person, or it's treated like a person, or we imagine it to be a person, but it's a big area. Inside that guy with armor, inside this circle, are people who do not live under the same constitution we do. I'm sorry, but that's essentially the case. They are protected by corporate law. You're not a corporation, you're not part of a corporation, you're not upper management of a corporation, you don't have say over how gatekeepers are used, and all the revenue that comes to a corporation, they decide fairly autocratically where it goes. Voila, most of it stays in the circle. Some of it, yeah, trickles down. You might like the little cloud with the little raindrops there. Yeah, that's wages. We'll squeeze that as much as possible. But that's the engine of inequality to me. And it's gotten much worse over the last 30, 40 years. They've perfected this model at this point. Everything goes there. Few people make the decisions. They keep most of it. They're required to maximize profits for shareholders, but they're the shareholders. And everybody else gets what they decide to give them. The result of all this is, here's our armored guy with people inside it, working the levers and this and that. The upshot is that wages, from the 1970s or so, wages used to be 54% of the economy, GDP, and GDP is, by definition, equal to national income. GDP is the product produced. National income is what people were paid to produce the product. It's identical. It's by definition. So it went from 54 to 44 over the last 30, 40 years. So it's nice to say that wages are stagnant, but when you look at it that way, they plunged. Now, they've gone down 10%, so saying that things didn't change, this whole power relationship didn't change, we would have continued at 54% of the economy, more or less. But it's 10% lower. Out of an $18 million economy, that's $1.8 trillion. And lo and behold, this is Federal Reserve data. You can look this up. FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data. Go to those sites. Wages. And amazingly, when I first looked at this, I couldn't believe it. This is 2012 data or 2013 data. I don't suspect the trends have changed any. Profits from the 1970s were 100 million, I don't know, something like that. Pretty much down at the bottom there. Now, in 2010 or so, they're 1.8 trillion. I mean, it was stunning when I first saw this. Wages, to me, wages are down. They managed to rig the system such that wages are down 1.8 trillion and profits are up 1.8 trillion. And these guys run around the landscape, trundling around, doing whatever they want, and they are protected by armor, by personhood, by equal protection, due process. But that's the story. And unless we start somehow or other peeling away some of these layers or really investigating their Achilles heel, their corporate charters, and getting at that, I don't see this changing much. And just in case you want to know what 1.8 trillion amounts to, well, out of a population of 320 million, that's 5,000 plus for every man, woman, and child. Or if you want to look at it as a family of four, it's $22,000. And I want to use this at our next time we're at a conference or something. We could say, okay, yeah, here's how much this is costing you. We're just asking for $40 a year. We're trying to get this back for you. All right, so hopefully this is some food for thought. And I promise I will set up a Zoom conference soon, and we can discuss this also. When I transmit this presentation, I'll do the paper copies. You can mark them up, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so Corporate Power Task Force. See you online soon. All right.